Power makes all things right. That is my first law and my last. Think about that for a second. That single, chilling statement completely shatters the foundation of everything you thought you knew about traditional fantasy. Welcome to This Explainer. I'm your host, and today we're venturing into a world that is brilliantly grounded, brutally realistic, and driven way more by backroom politics than by some grand magical destiny. We are talking about Joe Abercrombie's absolute masterpiece, the First Law Trilogy, starting right at the beginning with the blade itself. Look, if you're the kind of reader who enjoys morally gray protagonists, massive political intrigue, and stories where literally no one gets a simple good or evil label, you are going to absolutely love this.
So today, our mission is to dissect exactly how this series operates. We are looking at the anatomy of the Grim. From a literary standpoint, the First Law is actually less of a traditional high fantasy series and much more of a gripping, high-stakes political thriller. It spans the fractured Union, the freezing Savage North, and the sprawling Gurkish Empire. It just, happens to wear the disguise of swords and sorcery. It's a brilliant narrative insurgency. Abercrombie didn't just write a fantasy story here, he completely deconstructed the entire heroic fantasy genre, and we're going to break down exactly how he pulled it off.
Right from the jump, Abercrombie hits us with a jarring paradigm shift. You see, traditional fantasy promises us noble struggles, guaranteed happy endings, and wise mentors guiding pure-hearted youths. The First Law? Yeah, it gives us something entirely different. It rips away that romanticism and replaces it with this grim utilitarianism. A lot of readers actually compare this series to Game of Thrones, mainly because of the heavy political manipulation and moral ambiguity. But the First Law really carves out its own distinct identity. It does this through a heavy, brilliant dose of black comedy and an utter refusal to give us any traditional heroes.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining Grimdark, then move into how the series subverts the hero, take a look at the corporate wizard, explore magic as mass destruction, and finally, go over the best reading order.
Section 1. Defining Grimdark, a world without eucatastrophe.
Okay, so to really get this, we need to understand what Grimdark is actually reacting against. It's reacting against something called eucatastrophe. This is a term originally coined by J.R.R. Tolkien, and it basically describes that comforting fantasy belief that no matter how incredibly dark things get, struggle and sacrifice will inevitably lead to a sudden, joyous turn of events, a guaranteed happy ending. Grimdark fundamentally throws a wrench into this cherished concept. In Abercrombie's world, if it seems highly unlikely a situation will turn out well, I promise you, it probably won't.
In the First Law, raw human nature is front and center. Sure, characters aspire to great things, but their efforts are usually entirely in vain. Abercrombie intentionally muddies the waters when it comes to motivations. Survival consistently always trumps heroism. Characters might not even want to do the right thing, or honestly, they might be completely incapable of figuring out what the right thing even is. This is a world where violence just becomes a relentless, inescapable habit, and history has a devastating tendency to repeat itself.
Section 2. Subverting the fantasy hero.
The blade itself kicks off by throwing us right into the middle of three simultaneous perspectives. Up in the freezing north, we've got Logen Ninefingers, literally the most feared warrior in the land, who is just desperately trying to survive. Down in Adua, the capital city of the Union, we meet Jezal Luthar, this young, entirely self-obsessed nobleman training for a fencing contest. And then, wow, we have Sandan Glokta. He is a former war hero who was captured, brutally tortured, and left crippled, only to come back home and become a torturer himself for the King's Inquisition. And as the story expands, they're joined by this unforgettable cast, like the fiercely driven Ferro Maljinn, the tragically honorable Cullum West, and a completely ruthless band of Northmen like Dogman and Black Dow. They are all defined by their contradictions and these incredibly sharp internal monologues.
Now this perfectly illustrates the absolute genius of Abercrombie's character work, especially with a guy like Jezal. See, Jezal consciously casts himself in the role of the classic fantasy hero. He literally stares at his own jawline in the mirror, totally convinced he's destined for greatness and legends. But the stark reality? He's immature, he's cowardly, and he is unbelievably vain. The world simply refuses to let him play the hero. He is, unknowingly, just a pawn in a much larger, much darker game of political manipulation.
If you really want to understand these characters, just listen to what they say. It's all in the dialogue. Logen constantly repeats, you have to be realistic about these things. He uses it to justify the most horrific acts necessary just to survive. Then you have Glokta's pitch-black humor shining through his constant cynical musing, body found floating by the docks. It's his personal grim reminder of the fatal cost of failure in politics. And Logen's "better to do it than live with the fear of it" shows exactly how he uses proactive violence just to cure his own anxiety. Abercrombie's sharp writing literally forces you to root for these deeply flawed, borderline psychopathic characters, totally against your own best judgment.
Section 3. The Corporate Wizard.
I like to call this the Gandalf deception. In high fantasy, the wizard is the wise mentor, right? The guy who guides our heroes to a moral victory. When we first meet Bayaz, the first of the Magi, he totally seems to fit the bill. He's this grumpy old man, hanging out in a remote library, gathering up a party of adventurers. But the reality is that Bayaz is effectively the chairman of the board. He doesn't just use magic. He manipulates the closed council and the open council. He leverages the massive banking systems, and he orchestrates royal succession to control the entire union like it's his own personal subsidiary. It's the diplomacy, the closed-door meetings, and the debt that drive this story, way more than fireballs ever do.
Bayaz completely rejects all notions of honor. He says rules are for children. This is war, and in war, the only crime is to lose. This proves a truly terrifying point about the First Law universe. The supposed wise sage is actually a ruthless CEO. The so-called villain is the only one telling the truth about how power is actually exercised in the real world. It's just a masterful exploration of how absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Section 4. Magic as Mass Destruction. In most fantasy epics, the heroes go on a grand quest to find a magical artifact to heal the land or banish the darkness. Well, Abercrombie gives us the seed. Sourced from the demonic, terrifying realm known as the Other Side, it's this ancient power locked away by the mythic figure Ooze. But the seed isn't meant to save the world. It is a literal nuclear deterrent. Bayaz is seeking it purely to maintain his geopolitical hegemony against his ancient rival in the Gurkish Empire, Khalul. Magic in this world isn't whimsical. It feels incredibly rare, deeply mysterious, and above all, intensely dangerous.
When the ultimate conflict finally erupts in the capital city of Adua, it is absolutely not some glorious cinematic battle of good versus evil. The fallout is horrific. We're talking radioactive sickness, hair loss, and the literal wasting of the city. It is the incredibly callous deployment of a tactical weapon right in the middle of a populated urban center just to protect a political asset. Abercrombie's combat is always painfully believable, from the very practical, grueling sword fighting to the gruesome, realistic injuries, all the way to the lasting psychological scars of what is essentially industrial warfare.
Section 5. The series reading order.
Okay, so this universe is massive, but it's really well structured. You're going to start with Phase 1, which is the core original trilogy. From there, you move to Phase 2, which consists of 3 absolutely incredible standalone novels that flesh out different corners of the world. Then there's Phase 3, a collection of short stories called Sharp Ends that give some great background flavor. And finally, you hit Phase 4, the Age of Madness trilogy, which actually jumps forward in time to show the brutal consequences of the Industrial Revolution hitting this already grim world.
But your foundation absolutely has to be the original 3 books. The Blade itself, Before They Are Hanged, and Last Argument of Kings. It's structured so well. The Blade itself takes its time, meticulously introducing us to the characters and the stakes. Then, Before They Are Hanged drastically expands the world and plunges us into brutal northern warfare. Finally, Last Argument of Kings violently yanks every single political string together for an insane emotional payoff. These 3 books are essential for establishing the moral tone before you branch out. Honestly, they are the exact reason this series changed modern fantasy and is considered one of the defining works of the 21st century.
I want to leave you with a provocative question to chew on. In a world where the sage is a ruthless CEO, the hero is a borderline psychopath, and magic is essentially a nuclear deterrent, who are you actually rooting for? The sheer brilliance of Joe Abercrombie is that you will find yourself rooting for all of them, and none of them, at the exact same time. Now look, if you want standard, shining heroes, or if you can't stomach graphic violence and a slow burn beginning, this might not be your cup of tea. But if you love morally gray protagonists, intense political fantasy, and character-driven masterpieces, you literally owe it to yourself to experience the First Law. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the narrative.